Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we take the sources you give us and, well, we boil them down. We find the core insights.
Yeah, it's like a shortcut to getting really informed, but without, drowning in information.
Exactly. And you, the learner, you're the reason we do this. You're curious, you want to understand things deeply, but your time's valuable.
So today we're diving into Buddhist meditation. We're using excerpts from A Swift Pair of Messengers that you provided, specifically looking at samatha, tranquility, and vipassanā, which is insight.
Now look, if you've ever dipped your toes into Buddhist meditation, you've probably noticed things aren't always straightforward. The author of our source mentions this right off the bat. There are lots of different ideas. Sometimes they even clash.
Yeah, so if you felt a bit lost trying to figure out meditation advice, you're definitely not alone.
Right.
And our goal here, it isn't really to add another opinion to the mix. It's more about clarifying what samatha and vipassanā actually mean, how they work in the original Buddhist teachings based purely on this text.
And it's probably good to remember who the author is writing for. It seems like it's not total beginners, necessarily.
Wait, it's aimed more at people who already know a bit about Buddhist meditation, maybe practice it, but are, confused by all the different takes out there.
Okay. And the author makes a point of saying the Buddha himself is like the ultimate teacher here.
That's fundamental. And the book starts with this really interesting warning almost about words.
Okay.
How words can sort of fall short of the actual experience. They use this Swan River example.
Right. You could say Swan River, but that doesn't give you the smell of the water, the feeling of the breeze.
Exactly. It's just a label. And the author uses that to show how easily we can get tangled up in the terms for meditation, samatha, vipassanā, jhāna, and maybe miss the living reality they point to.
So keep the experience in mind, not just the definitions.
Precisely. So as we dig into samatha and vipassanā, remember they're pointing to actual shifts in your mind, not just ideas. The text says they represent a fundamental split in Buddhist meditation practice.
The direct route, it says.
Yeah, often called the direct way to ultimate reality.
Okay, so digging into that, something really jumped out at me. The author seems to be, making a case for samatha. It needs defending.
That's a really key point in the text, yeah. The argument is that samatha, this deep calm, this tranquility, needs to be sort of rehabilitated, put back on equal footing with vipassanā.
Why? Has it been neglected?
The author thinks so. There's this modern tendency maybe to chase after insight, that aha moment of vipassanā, and kind of skip over the foundational work of cultivating deep calm.
Like wanting the results without the groundwork.
Kind of. And the author argues that serenity, that samatha quality, is incredibly valuable, maybe especially now in our, frantic world. It's like trying to see clearly in choppy water versus still water.
That makes a lot of sense. But the author also seems a bit wary of some modern meditation language, terms that maybe weren't around originally.
Yes, exactly. They raise concerns about what they call later teachings and specific terms you hear a lot today, like momentary samādhi, access samādhi, even vipassanā.
Okay.
These terms aren't really found in the earliest Buddhist scriptures, the suttas. And the concern is that maybe these newer labels are subtly changing how we understand the path, maybe steering us away from the original map.
So if those terms are relatively new, how do the early texts, the suttas, talk about samādhi? What does that word usually mean there?
Good question. The text emphasizes that in the suttas, samādhi very often means the 4 jhanas.
And jhanas are.
Think of them as deep states of meditative absorption, really profound levels of concentration and stillness. Unless the context clearly suggests something else, samādhi in the suttas usually points to these jhanas.
But not always.
Not always. The text does note that sometimes samādhi can also describe the kind of concentration present during insight practice, vipassanā, or even the unified state of mind that comes with liberation itself. But the default tends to be jhāna.
Okay, now that term you mentioned earlier, vipassanā jhāna, that sounds like a real sticking point for the author. What's the problem with it?
Yeah, they spend some time on this. The author suggests that vipassanā jhāna might be a later development, possibly stemming from a tendency to label the techniques themselves as either samatha or vipassanā.
Not to the qualities they develop.
Exactly. So you might be doing a practice labeled vipassanā, maybe noting sensations or thoughts. And if feelings of, say, joy or peace arise during that,
which can happen.
Right. Then those feelings got labeled vipassanā jhāna because they happened during a vipassanā technique.
But the author's point is that those feelings, joy, peace, equanimity, Those are the qualities of samatha and jhana, traditionally speaking.
Precisely. The emotional qualities experienced are being called vipassanā, but according to the author's reading of the suttas, they are actually the hallmarks of samatha concentration, the very definition of jhana factors. It's like mislabeling the fruit.
Interesting. And what about this idea of like an instant path, a sudden zap of enlightenment? Does the author address that?
They do. The text looks at this idea, which seems to come more from later commentaries, of a super brief path moment where enlightenment stages supposedly flash by.
Right. We hear about that sometimes.
But the author argues pretty strongly that you don't really find support for that in the suttas themselves. The suttas consistently talk about the path as a process, a gradual cultivation. Like learning any complex skill, it takes time and effort.
Is there an analogy they use for that?
Yeah, a really nice one. Chicks hatching from eggs, they don't just suddenly appear. There's a whole period of incubation, gradual development, and then they slowly peck their way out.
Okay, so it's a journey, not just a destination arrival.
That's the picture painted based on the suttas, yes.
So we've got these potential later interpretations, or maybe confusing terms. How does the book itself, A Swift Pair of Messengers, describe how samatha and vipassana are supposed to work together? What's that swift pair about?
Yeah. The title comes from a really powerful simile the Buddha used. He compared samatha and vipassana to a swift pair of messengers.
Messengers. Delivering what?
Delivering a message in accordance with reality, which is nibbana, or liberation, to the Lord of the city.
The Lord of the city being?
Our consciousness, our mind. And in this simile, mindfulness is the gatekeeper who lets the messengers in, and the Noble Eightfold Path is the road they travel on.
Wow, okay. That's a vivid image. They're a team delivering the crucial message.
A team, exactly. They work together.
And does the author offer a kind of shorthand way to think about what each messenger focuses on?
Yes, broadly speaking, the text characterizes samatha as being mainly about emotional development. Think, calming the passions, the letting go of craving and aversion, developing emotional balance.
Okay, the heart stuff, maybe?
Sort of, yeah.
Yep.
And vipassana is presented as being more about intellectual development, so the fading away of ignorance, gaining wisdom, understanding the true nature of things.
So heart and mind development, working in tandem. It sounds like you really need both.
Absolutely essential. According to this text's reading of the suttas, they constantly stress that both samatha and vipassana need to be developed. There's even a quote from Venerable Ananda, one of the Buddha's chief disciples, explicitly saying you need both for liberation.
And this balance, this partnership, it shows up in other Buddhist frameworks too, like the 37 Wings to Enlightenment. That sounds important.
It is. It's a major framework in the suttas, grouping together all the key qualities you need to cultivate. It includes things like the 4 foundations of mindfulness, the 5 spiritual faculties, the 7 factors of enlightenment, and the Noble Eightfold Path.
So a big checklist for awakening.
Kind of, yeah. And the author points out that this whole structure really emphasizes the harmony needed between the emotional side, samatha, and the intellectual side, vipassanā. The Noble Eightfold Path is seen as the most crucial summary within that.
Okay, and within that Eightfold Path, where does samadhi, that concentration piece, fit?
The last 3 parts of the path, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration, samādhi, are grouped together. They form what's called the aggregate of samādhi.
So samadhi is right concentration, but it depends on effort and mindfulness too.
Exactly. And the text particularly highlights that right effort is considered the prerequisite. You need that effort to even get the concentration going.
Now, earlier you mentioned samadhi being a basis for reviewing. Can you unpack that a bit? What does that mean practically?
Yeah, it's an interesting idea. It suggests that samadhi, particularly the deep stability of jhana, creates this incredibly clear and steady state of mind.
Like a calm wake.
Perfect analogy. And when you emerge from that state, you're in a much better position to clearly see, reflect upon, and really understand the insights, vipassanā, that might have arisen, or things you want to investigate. The stability allows for deeper analysis.
So the calm helps the clarity stick, or be understood better.
That seems to be the idea, yeah.
We touched on this, but the author seems keen to draw a line between Buddhist samadhi and maybe other meditations or yogic practices that were around before the Buddha.
Very much so. The text stresses that while techniques for concentration definitely existed before Buddhism, Buddhist samadhi isn't just any concentration. It's specifically noble right samadhi.
Noble right samadhi. What makes it right or noble?
It's right because it's connected to the rest of the Eightfold Path. It has the prerequisites, right view, right intention, the ethical conduct parts. It's not just about getting focused. It's about getting focused for the purpose of liberation, guided by wisdom and ethics.
So it's concentration plus the whole ethical and wisdom framework.
Exactly. That's the distinction being made.
And mindfulness. We said it was the gatekeeper. How does Satipatthana, right, mindfulness, connect to all this?
Well, right mindfulness, sati, is presented as the foundation, the very basis of samadhi. It's what allows samatha and vipassanā to even enter the city of consciousness, like in that messenger simile. And the text clarifies that satipatthana isn't just vague general awareness. It refers to a specific set of meditative exercises contemplating body, feelings, mind, and mental qualities that cultivate this precise, non-judgmental attention.
Got it. So going back to the jhanas, these deep states, the author argues they do more than just feel good or provide stability. They actually help tackle our inner obstacles.
Absolutely. A key point is how jhana practice works on the 5 hindrances.
Which are?
Things like sensual desire, ill will, restlessness and worry, sloth and torpor and doubt. These are seen as the main obstacles clouding the mind.
Right.
By cultivating jhana, you essentially cut off these hindrances, at least temporarily. The deep concentration doesn't give them space to arise, and in doing so, the text argues, you're starving the root of ignorance, avijja, creating the conditions for wisdom to dawn.
So less hindrance, less ignorance, more clarity.
That's the dynamic described.
The book also brings up something called dependent liberation.
Yeah.
How does samadhi figure into that framework?
Dependent liberation is another way the suttas describe the path, showing how different positive qualities arise in sequence, each conditioning the next. Like, virtue leads to non-regret, which leads to joy, which leads to tranquility.
A chain reaction towards freedom.
Exactly. And the text points out that in many of these sequences, you see virtue leading to samadhi, and then samadhi being the condition for knowledge and vision of things as they really are, leading to disenchantment, dispassion, and release.
And in that context, samadhi usually means...
Again, the author argues that in these dependent liberation sequences, samadhi very often implies the attainment of jhana.
Okay, so the author seems to be building a case that jhana isn't just helpful, but maybe even necessary for reaching certain stages.
That's definitely a central argument. The text digs into passages that seem to suggest that attaining jhana is actually a prerequisite, a necessary condition for achieving the vision of the Dhamma, that initial breakthrough experience known as stream entry.
Wow, okay. That's a strong claim, especially given how some modern approaches teach meditation.
It is a significant point, yes, challenging some common assumptions.
The book also talks about the gradual training. Is that like the practical day-to-day application of all this?
Pretty much. The gradual training describes the step-by-step way the path unfolds in practice. It typically starts with foundational things like ethical conduct, sila, then sense restraint, mindfulness, and then progresses to seeking seclusion to overcome the hindrances and cultivate
jhanas.
Exactly, cultivating meditative bliss, the joy and peace of the jhanas. And the text emphasizes this isn't just for monks and nuns.
Lay people too.
Yes, the Buddha explicitly encouraged lay followers to also seek out seclusion when possible and experience the rapture of seclusion, suggesting these deeper states are beneficial for everyone on the path.
So these jhanas aren't some kind of, I don't know, optional advanced extra. They have real benefits here and now.
That's the perspective presented. They're described as blissful abidings in the here and now. A key contrast is drawn between the fleeting, often problematic nature of sensual pleasures and the stable, reliable, and profound peace and happiness that comes from cultivating samadhi and jhana.
A different kind of happiness.
The much more reliable and fulfilling kind is the argument.
And what about people who've actually made progress on the path, the noble ones, as they're called?
Yes.
Does the text say anything about their relationship with jhana?
It makes a very strong case here. The author argues that if you look at how the suttas describe the noble ones, from the stream enterer who's had the first glimpse of nibbana, right up to the fully liberated arahant, they are consistently described as possessing samadhi.
And samadhi meaning jhana again.
Yes, defined as jhana as an essential factor of their path and as one of their developed spiritual faculties, the faculty of concentration.
What about those said to be released by understanding or released by wisdom? Does that imply they didn't need jhana?
The author tackles that too. They analyze those categories and argue that even being released by wisdom doesn't mean an absence of jhana. It might relate more to the degree of mastery or the specific way liberation was finalized, but the foundation of samadhi, jhana, is still considered present according to this reading.
So the argument is pretty comprehensive. Jhana is foundational. But what about those stories, the ones you sometimes hear about someone getting enlightened almost instantly? Maybe just hearing a phrase from the Buddha. How does the author square those?
Right, those accounts exist. The text examines some of these stories of apparent instant enlightenment. The suggestion isn't necessarily that they're untrue, but that they might not negate the gradual path or the role of jhana.
How so?
Well, maybe these individuals already had highly developed minds from past efforts, so the final breakthrough, including potentially rapid attainment of jhana, happened very quickly upon hearing the teaching.
So the groundwork was already there.
Potentially. Or perhaps some stories serve more as inspiration, pointing towards the path and its ultimate goal, rather than describing a literal shortcut that bypasses the necessary cultivation, including jhana.
Okay, so not necessarily a contradiction if you look deeper.
That's the author's perspective, yeah.
So wrapping it all up, what's the kind of final feeling or message the author leaves us with about jhana?
I think the main takeaway is that jhana shouldn't be seen as something weird or scary or unattainable or even optional for serious practice. Instead, it's presented as like a promise, a core part of the path that offers profound pleasure, stability, and clarity, something to be explored and cultivated, not bypassed. The author really encourages personal investigation.
Okay, right. So let's try and summarize this deep dive into a swift pair of messengers. What are the key things for you, the learner, to take away?
Well, first, the absolute interconnectedness of samatha and vipassanā, tranquility and insight. You need both. One supports the other.
The swift pair of messengers, working together. And samatha isn't just a preliminary, it's about deep emotional development, often culminating in the jhanas.
Exactly. And vipassanā is the intellectual development, the wisdom aspect. And the author makes a really robust case, drawing from the early texts, that jhana, deep meditative concentration, is crucial, not just helpful, but foundational for all levels of attainment described in the suttas.
Hopefully this discussion has maybe untangled some of the knots around these terms for you, giving a clearer picture based on this specific source.
Yeah, offering a perspective grounded in the author's reading of the early Buddhist texts.
So we really encourage you to sit with these ideas. How do they land with you? How do they relate to maybe your own experiences or understanding of meditation?
And maybe a final thought to mull over, something to take with you. If this text is right about the central importance of jhana in the original teachings, what does that mean for modern meditation approaches that often seem to downplay it or suggest you can kind of skip over developing that deep concentration?
Right. That's a provocative question. It definitely invites a closer look at the original sources and maybe a critical eye on how things are sometimes taught today.
Food for thought, definitely.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into a swift pair of messengers. We'll catch you on the next one.